This discussion is hosted by OGP Ambassador Helen Clark. Helen served 3 terms as Prime Minister of New Zealand and was the first woman to be Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme. Please welcome Helen Clark.
Good afternoon, everyone from New Zealand, and great to have some wonderful panelists today and contributors to our session on the future of governance in the Asia Pacific. And as we all know, our region is one of great geopolitical and geo-economic significance, and one in which the Open Government Partnership is proud to have very active members. Indonesia and the Philippines were among the founders of the partnership when it was launched 10 years ago, and today Korea is serving as our co-chair. We now have 13 national members and 17 local jurisdictions for OGP in the region. And added up together, they've made more than 700 commitments covering a range of policy areas. These include inspiring ideas like Korea's National Core Data Release Program, Indonesia's Open E-Procurement Platform, and the Philippines' Citizen Participatory Audit Process, all of which have been awarded the top 3 regional spots at the OGP Impact Awards. I should say, as well as being a global ambassador for Open Government Partnership, I also chair Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which is, of course, for good governance, for transparency, and for anti-corruption. And we have a significant overlap of membership with OGP and obviously very close sister organizations. But as we know, there is a significant number of countries in our Asia Pacific region which just aren't sufficiently open to be eligible to join the partnership. And we haven't seen a lot of much progress on this area in the last decade. While the partnership works to build more resilient democracies, the region obviously is not immune to global trends which have been stalling and even reversing momentum around open government. And for our region, of course, the most tragic event has been the military coup of the beginning of February this year, which threw democracy aside and has led to very serious repression, torture, death, injury, jailing of people committed to democracy. As well, we see the trends of growing domestic inequality, diminished investments in public services and infrastructure. We're fighting the impacts of climate change. We see narrowing civic space. Corruption remains an issue in many places. And of course, demographic changes. An aging population is posing new governance challenges and policy challenges. And put on top of all that, the pandemic, which has been so devastating for our world and has taken its toll in our region as well. So today, we're asking in this panel, which trends, political, economic, and social, have most influenced governance in our region over the last decade of OGP's life? What challenges and priorities for both governments and civil society lie over the horizon? And how can an open government approach help us meet these challenges? How can open government partnership itself adapt to see that it remains relevant and fit for purpose as it enters its 2nd decade? The partnership is lucky to count within its community so many people who've worked at the front lines of the hard work and thinking about these questions. And we're joined by many of them today for what's going to be a great conversation. We have a lot to talk about, and time is never long enough. So we're glad to have you all here for it. And we welcome your reflections in the discussion on the chat. If you have specific questions to put to speakers, can you put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen? And the OGP support unit will be helping me to choose a few to share in the discussion today. Inevitably, we can never answer every question, but we're going to do our best. And please share your thoughts on our discussion using the hashtag OGP Summit on your social media. So let's get underway with a welcome message from the Minister of the Interior and Safety of the Republic of Korea, John Hae-chol, to open our discussions. This minister is the one in charge of the OGP relationship for the government of Korea and OGP. Let's roll the video.
안녕하십니까. 대한민국 행정안전부 장관 전해철입니다. 지난 2018년 서울에서 OGP 아태 지역회의를 개최한 이후 3년여 만에 아태 지역 열린정부 리더분들을 다시 뵙게 된 것을 기쁘게 생각합니다. 특별히 오늘 회의 진행을 맡아주실 헬렌 클라크 OGP 대사님, 토론에 참여해 주실 필리핀 예산관리부 티나로즈 장관님과 인도네시아 국가개발계획부 소아로소 장관님, 그리고 니콜라 닉스 아시아재단 이사님을 비롯해 아태 지역 8개국을 대표하여 참석해 주신 정부와 시민사회 관계자 여러분께 감사드립니다. 전 세계 인구의 60%가 거주하는 아태 지역은 문화적 다양성과 그 수준이 특히 높습니다. 급속한 경제 발전을 바탕으로 세계에서 가장 역동적이며 높은 발전 잠재력을 보유한 지역이기도 합니다. 아태 지역은 이러한 다양성과 역동성을 바탕으로 열린 정부의 가치를 구현하기 위한 혁신적인 노력도 활발하게 진행하고 있습니다. 특별히 아태 지역에서는 경제, 사회 전 분야에서 디지털 전환이 빠르게 이루어지고 있고 이를 활용한 시민들의 참여 통로가 넓어짐에 따라 정부의 개방성과 투명성에 대한 기대감도 더욱 커지고 있습니다. 오늘 회의 참여국인 필리핀의 경우 지난 2015년 시민참여 감사제도 도입을 시작으로 예산 편성과 집행 과정에서의 투명성과 효율성을 높이기 위한 다양한 정책적 시도를 확대해 나가고 있습니다. 인도네시아는 2012년에 도입한 민원 접수 창구인 라포르를 디지털 기술과 접목하여 라포르 앱으로 혁신함으로써 코로나 상황으로 인한 어려움 속에서도 단절없이 시민들의 다양한 요구를 빠르게 수용해 나가고 있습니다. 위 두 사례는 필리핀과 인도네시아가 OGP에 참여하면서 도입하고 발전시킨 것이라는 점에서도 큰 의미를 갖습니다. 대한민국 정부도 열린 정부의 가치를 구현하기 위해 끊임없이 노력하고 있습니다. 2013년 공공데이터법 제정을 시작으로 공공데이터 포털 구축 등을 통해 정부가 가진 정보와 데이터를 국민들에게 선제적으로 제공함으로써 정부의 투명성을 높이고 있습니다. 2016년부터는 국가 중점 데이터 조기 개방을 OGP 국가 실행계획의 핵심 이행 과제로도 선정하여 적극 추진하고 있습니다. 그 결과 현재 약 6만 6천여 건의 공공데이터가 국민에게 제공되어 정부의 투명성을 높이고 있습니다. 또한 일자리, 부동산 등 국민생활과 밀접한 분야에서 신규 서비스 개발도 활발하게 이루어져 많은 국민들이 모바일을 통해 편리하게 이용하고 있습니다. 최근 코로나19 상황에서는 공적 마스크 데이터에 이어 백신 접종 관련 데이터도 빠르게 개방함으로써 위기 극복과 일상 회복을 위해 국민과 함께 힘써 나가고 있습니다. 이처럼 국민과 함께 실현하고 있는 열린 정부의 가치는 OECD 공공데이터 평가 3회 연속 1위, OGP 혁신 어워드 아태 지역 3위 등 국제사회의 높은 평가로 또한 이어지고 있습니다. 공감하시듯 계속되고 있는 코로나19의 위기 상황은 각국 정부의 역할에 매우 큰 도전과 변화의 과제를 던져주고 있습니다. 오늘 OGP 글로벌 서밋을 계기로 열리는 아태 지역 회의는 새로운 변화의 시대에 아태 지역이 나아가야 할 연대의 방향을 찾는 소중한 기회가 될 것입니다. 함께하고 계시는 아태 지역 정부와 시민사회 활동가 여러분께서 아태 지역에 걸맞는 열린 정부 실천 방안을 활발히 논의해 주실 것으로 기대합니다. 다시 한번 회의에 참석해 주신 8개국 정부 관계자 여러분과 시민사회 활동가 여러분께 감사드리고 여러분 모두의 건강과 행운 기원합니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you so much, Minister Jean. And now we will hear a message from the Deputy Prime Minister of Mongolia. Please roll the video.
Нээлттэй засгийн түншлэл дээд хэмжээний чуулганыг амжилттай зохион байгуулж байгаа эрхэм мөндөд ерөнхийлөгч Мун Жэ-ин чуулганд оролцогч хүндэт, зочид, төлөөлөгчдөө та бүхэнд нээлттэй засгийн түншлэл олон талт санаачилгын 10 жилийн ой мэндийг дэвшүүлж чин сэтгэлийн баяр хүргэе. Олон улсын нээлттэй засгийн түншлэл нь 70 гаруй орныг игнэнд багтаасан том байгууллага болсон бөгөөд улс бүхэн нээлттэй засгийн түншлэлийн хүрээнд тавьсан зорилгодоо хэрхэн хүрэх талаар өөр хоорондоо бодит туршлага солилцсон суралцаж, сан санаачлагаа бусадтай хуваалцсан нээлттэй, ил тод, хариуцлагатай засаглалыг дэмжиж, амлсан үүргээ амлалттай биелүүлэхийн төлөө хамтран ажилдагт талархаж байгаагаа илэрхийлье. Нээлттэй засгийн түншлэл олон улсын хурлын эрхэм мөндөд зочид төлөөлөгчдөө бид хүн төрлөختөнд дэлхийн 2 дугаар дайнаас хойш туулж үзээгүй COVID-19-ийн цар тахлын нэн хүнд сорилтын цаг үед ажиллаж амьдарч байна. Хэдийгээр дэлхийд даяар нөхцөл байдал амаргүй байгаа ч та бид нээлттэй засгийн түншлэлийн дэвшүүлсэн зорилтуудаас ухарч болохгүй. Монгол улс нээлттэй засгийн түншлэлийн дэвшүүлсэн иргэний орон зайг бэхжүүлэх, авилгатай тэмцэх, хүртээмжтэй цахим инновацийг хөгжүүлэх зорилтуудын хүрээнд 2021-с 23 онд хэрэгжүүлэх үйл ажиллагааны үндэсний 4 дахь төлөвлөгөөг боловсруулж үндсэн 9 үүрэг амлалтыг тодорхойлоод байна. Эдгээр зорилтын хүрээнд Монгол улсын засгийн газар төрийн үйл ажиллагааг ил тод болгох, иргэдийн оролцоог дэмжих, хэвлэл мэдээллийн эрх зүйн орчныг бэхжүүлэх, авилгыг бууруулах, төрийн үйлчилгээнд шин дэвшилтэт техник технологиг нэвтрүүлэхээр ажиллаж байна. Бид авилга, албан тушаалын гэмт хэрэгтээ тэмцэх асуудлыг COVID-19-ийн цар тахлыг даван туулах сорилт бэрхшээлтэй адил түвшинд авч үзэж, онцгой анхаарлаа хандуулж байна. Үүнд нэгдүгээрт цахим засаглалыг хөгжүүлэх замаар төрийн хүнд сурталыг халж, ил тод нээлттэй болгох, авилгатай тэмцэх иргэдийн оролцоог дэмжих суур шинжилэлүүдийг хийж эхэллээ. Хоёрдугаарт авилгатай тэмцэх эрх зүйн орчныг сайжруулах замаар авилгатай тэмцэж, төр иргэний нийгмийн уялдаа холбоог хангах ажлыг эрчимжүүллээ. Засгийн газраас авилга, албан тушаалын гэмт хэрэгтэнд оноож буй ялыг чангатгах талаар эрүүгийн хуульд нэмэлт өөрчлөлт оруулах ажлын хэсэг ажилуулж байна. Мөн Монгол улс анх удаа шүгэл үлээгчийн эрх зүйн байдлын тухай хуулийн төслийг боловсруулж улсын их хурлд өргөн бариад байна. 3 дугаарт нээлттэй засгийн түншлэлийн хүрээнд олон улсын хамтын ажиллагааг шин түвшинд гаргах шаардлагатай байна. Монгол улсын засгийн газрын үндсэн зорилтуудын нэг нь нээлттэй засаглал юм. Монгол улсын засгийн газар нээлттэй засгийн түншлэлийг бүх талаар дэмжиж, үйл ажиллагааны үндэсний төлөвлөгөөнд дэвшүүлсэн Монгол улсын амлалтуудыг хэрэгжүүлэхийн төлөө ажиллах болно. Дээд хэмжээний чуулганы үйл ажиллагаанд амжилт хүсье.
And thank you so much to the Deputy Prime Minister of Mongolia. Let's never forget that Mongolia went out front with the Millennium Development Goals with a 9th goal on good governance. It's been very serious about good governance, and we really appreciate the support. Lastly, in the recorded messages, we have one from Suharsono Afu, the Minister of National Development Planning of the Republic of Indonesia. Let's play the video.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, in the midst of the COVID-19, the Corruption Perception Index 2020 by Transparency International shows that a lack of transparency in the allocation of resources weakens the efficacy of COVID-19 crisis response. This, without a doubt, will undermine governance and democracy in the long run. Thus, the spirit of open government, transparency, and accountability is needed, especially as a part of COVID-19 response. For Indonesia, good governance is important, not only in time of crisis. Indonesia is always the proponent in supporting the OGP priority agenda. Open Government Indonesia National Action Plan shows our anti-corruption spirit, namely the first commitment open contracting in government procurement, and 15th commitment information portal on COVID-19 response and recovery budget. Ladies and gentlemen, the multidimensional challenges brought forth by the pandemic requires collective effort and synergy between all stakeholders. Despite the challenges, the pandemic has also become a catalyst for many OGP member and non-member countries in implementing the principle of open government. In this regard, OGP has offered a platform to bring non-governmental actors as a strategic partner for the government to assist the government in providing more affordable public services and building a more transparent government. Therefore, to overcome the pandemic through cooperation and multi-stakeholder participation, OGP should provide a more sustainable co-creation model that can be replicated by the member countries. We hope all related stakeholders could work together against corruption practices and create a transparent, effective, and fair pandemic response in the long run. Aside from tackling the pandemic, we also have less than a decade to achieve our common 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. We must redouble our effort to achieve SDGs, including by fighting corruption and creating good governance. Corruption has a disproportionate impact on the poor and most vulnerable, increasing costs and reducing access to public services. It also contributes to environmental degradation. Thus, we must reinvigorate our global partnership to rather political commitment in creating open, accountable, and transparent government. Indonesia, as the founding member of OGP, will continue to support the spirit of good governance at a global level, including in our G20 presidency next year. The Indonesia G20 presidency will continue promoting integrity as we strengthen our anti-corruption system and institution, using lessons learned from the handling of the pandemic to recover and develop the economy in the future. We will also enhance the transparency of our action to deal with the impacts of climate change, as we are committed to advocating a green economy and sustainable development in line with the Paris Agreement. The Indonesia G20 presidency will continue to develop targeted new action, focusing our work on key topics where the G20 can best add value. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the Minister from Indonesia, and particularly drawing that strong connection between open government and our success in achieving the SDGs. So we're coming now to the first segment of the panel, and we are going to start by broadly speaking about the governance trends that have got us to where we are today. And first panelist we're joined by is Nicola Nixon, who is Senior Director of Governance at the Asia Foundation and an expert on the governance dimensions of a range of development policy areas, including poverty reduction, social development, gender equality, anti-corruption, and countering violent extremism. That's quite a mouthful. So, Nicola, over the past decade, what do you see as having been the key political, social, and economic trends which have been influencing the way in which countries in our Asia-Pacific region are governed? And how do these differ from trends affecting other parts of the world? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Helen. I'm just going to double check that I can be heard clearly. All good at this end? Okay, so it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really grateful to OGP for the opportunity to join this conversation today. And a warm hello to everybody who's watching this morning. Look, it's a great question, and it's, in a sense, it's one that's even more pertinent at this point in the COVID pandemic, because a number of trends that we've seen over the last decade, sort of sometimes a little bit in the background and well before the pandemic, particularly negative trends, have been accelerating, making them all the more obvious and all the more concerning. Now, I'm going to touch briefly on two of these. There are obviously also economic trends that I won't go into just at the moment that relate to the fact that there was steady economic growth throughout the region over the last decade, and we are now seeing that slow down and potentially reverse as a result of COVID. And some of the impacts of that are in the trends that I'll discuss as well. So two overarching and not unrelated trends that are particularly pertinent to this conversation today, and that Helen's already touched on in her opening remarks. So throughout Asia, although not solely in Asia, but also elsewhere, we are seeing what's become known as democratic regression, the erosion of political and civil rights of individuals and the civic spaces in which they find voice. In Freedom House's most recent global report, they noted that 10 Asian countries saw an increased erosion of key political and civil rights over the last 18 months. And that's in addition to an ongoing and longer term downward trend. And some, like India and the Philippines, Freedom House argues had a significant downturn in terms of reductions of freedoms around voice, association and movement. And during the same period, only 3 Asian countries saw an improvement. Now, that erosion is, in part, as we all know, because of the way COVID has been handled by some governments. We've seen many instances in which political leaders have taken advantage of the pandemic to remove democratic institutions and reduce civil and political spaces. In parts of Southeast and South Asia, where the Asia Foundation works primarily, we've seen governments rely on new or amended emergency laws to extend their powers and/or to restrict civil society activities and independent media, often framed as threats to national security or their ability to address the pandemic. And in some cases, civil society organisations have been directly targeted. And in many others, and this is something that we've been quite interested in researching, civil society organisations have been left out of relief efforts to which they arguably could have made a valuable contribution. So as numerous observers have pointed out, attacks on the media see governments increasingly becoming the sole arbiters of truth in the public realm. And that's the trend that's really quite concerning. So they're able to discredit criticism of actions as fake news, defamation or sedition. And sometimes that's particularly of concern when we're in a crisis situation like we are at the moment. ICNL, who I'm also pleased to see is speaking on some of the other panels in the summit this week, has recorded recent instances of crackdowns on speech and dissent using fake news or disinformation charges in 19 countries in the Asia region, and arrests of journalists for critical reporting are documented in 8. And this trend is contributing to democratic regression that in turn sees civic spaces shrinking, often quite dramatically, in almost every country in the region, impacting organisations beyond human rights defenders and the media, and including some countries that previously rated quite highly for their democratic standards. Now, this is not the whole story. In a couple of countries, at least, we've seen improvements in democratic governance over the last months. There have been instances in which the fast tracking of COVID response projects or approvals have been evident, or improved working relationships between civil society and government institutions. And we see that particularly in local communities and at local governance levels. But overall, democratic regression is a significant trend, and one that appears likely to continue into the post-COVID period. And from my perspective in Vietnam, I wonder when that might be. Now, I won't go into the detail of the drivers for democratic regression, but just to note that they are multiple and complex, and that they exist at national, regional and global levels, and include not only state-society relations within countries, but also the challenges that countries face in navigating local manifestations of global power rivalries in the region, where those are framed as a dichotomy between democratic freedoms and autocratic efficiency. Now, the second major trend I'll just touch on quickly is that's also accelerated by COVID, and that I know we are all watching with alarm, is rising inequalities. Not just economic, but also social and political. So existing data suggests that we're already seeing a steady or rapid rises, rapid increase in inequalities in wealth, income and access to employment, as well as ethnicity, minority status and gender, with the pandemic, but not again as new or as a result of it. Throughout the Asia region, those already marginalised have tended to be hit hardest by the pandemic in terms of lost jobs, homes, health and security. Migrant workers and ethnic and religious minorities have faced increased discrimination and more difficulties accessing basic services than ever before. And this means we're also seeing rising gender inequalities. And in some sectors and domains, this actually constitutes a previous positive trend that is now going backwards. For example, before the pandemic, women's rates of participation in the workforce in Asia had steadily been increasing for years. In Vietnam and China, women made up 50% of the total labour force in pre-pandemic times. Yet a range of factors are now turning that around. The level of informal labour in the region, as we all know, is extremely high. Women make up the largest percentage of informal workers, and informal workers have been the first to lose their jobs during the pandemic. Many of the worst hit industries are dominated by women: tourism, hospitality, the service industries, as well as education. And patriarchal norms on appropriate roles for men and women, while culturally specific, they are universally discriminatory against women, and they've seen women take on a larger amount of domestic and care work throughout the pandemic. Those norms and values are becoming reified, and as we've all seen, the pandemic has also led to an increase in domestic violence, which may take years, if not decades, to regain lost ground on reducing gender inequalities. And lastly, within these increasing inequalities brought about, there is also the increasing inequality that's brought about by the significance of the digital divide. Now, there's a positive side to the increase in uptake of digital technology during the pandemic. This rapid and quite unprecedented uptake by governments in the region to provide services and information to citizens, while obviously not without challenges, has really been quite amazing during 2020 and 2021. I can certainly say that from my vantage point here in Vietnam. It's increased the speed with which services are available, particularly social safety nets, and increased the flow of accurate information about the spread of the virus and changing government containment measures. So the uptake of digital technology is yet another trend that's accelerated, in some cases is providing other examples of where technology can contribute to the greater openness, transparency and accountability of governments. Just one really small example here in Vietnam, last September, when the local authorities in Ho Chi Minh City decided to take questions live from citizens during a public consultation on the management of the city's lockdown. And they did this for the first time on Facebook and had 70,000 people who were empowered to ask questions. Yet, as more and more basic services and information channels move online, the digital divide is becoming deeper. And this is particularly striking as access to public services requires the scanning, for example, of a QR code to get into public spaces. And with an estimated 1.8 billion people in Asia lacking access to the internet, the exclusion of marginalised groups will see the heightened inequalities, therefore, between the internet haves and have-nots. Very quickly, you ask how this differs from trends in other parts of the world. Quick 3 observations. First, in terms of scale, the Asia region is the most populous in the world, containing 50% of the world's population. And it's also home to 2 of the 3 largest democracies, India and Indonesia. Secondly, in terms of vulnerability, particularly to democratic regression, many of Asia's democracies were already quite fragile pre-COVID, as I said. Sorry, just a moment. And you know, they were at risk of manipulation and elite capture, riddled in some cases with clientelism, patronage, nepotism, and quite stridently focused on narrow economic growth targets. And so weak democratic foundations will make COVID recovery that is equitable and inclusive and open even more difficult. And thirdly, I guess there's also this geopolitical level that we shouldn't forget, that Asia is likely to be the region where the next great power contest will play out, and it'll be shaped by actors in the region as much as, if not more than, they are shaped by it. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you. Back to you, Helen.
Thanks very much, Nicola, and some very important points made there about the erosion of media freedoms and civic space, and also on the inequalities, because while it's been a pandemic of disease, it's also been a pandemic of exacerbating inequalities as well. So hopefully we can pick some of these themes up in the question time. Let's move straight along to Dinardo Musakova, who's Director for Civil Society Initiative at the University of Central Asia in Bishkek. Dinara is leading several initiatives promoting improvement of media development, local governance, civil society, political processes, human rights, rule of law. Well, there's a long list, and it's wonderful stuff. So Dinara, in your work across Central Asia, how are you seeing governance trends over the past decade impacting on democratization, space for civil society, and open government initiatives? In short, are we making any progress?
Okay, thank you, Helen. Hello to everyone. I'm really glad to introduce Central Asia region in this global summit, and I will talk about the political, social, about the civic space in Central Asia countries, and about the open government agenda also. So, and I want to start my speech with talking about the civil society space in our countries. So in Central Asia, the authorities continue to narrow the already limited space for civil society. And pandemic has contributed to the growth of corruption and the adoption of number of political decisions without the public discussion. So thus in this year, a new constitution was adopted in the Kyrgyz Republic with the absolute presidential form of government, which significantly violates to the balance of the power. Before this country, Kyrgyz Republic was a parliamentary country with minimum of presidential powers. So also without public discussions, a discriminatory norm was adopted on additional financial statement of NGOs, while commercial entities do not have additional reporting. And also a bill on foreign agent is being introduced into the legislation of NGOs in Kyrgyz Republic. So within the other neighbor countries as Kazakhstan and Tajikistan, civil society sector has faced with a wave of political pressure directed against a group of leading civil society organizations promoting democracy, when the representative of tax authorities with the support of state security services accuse them of failing to properly account for the foreign funds they received in the past. So, and observers from these countries attribute the short-term pressure campaign to the fear of public control over election on the eve of parliamentary election in Kazakhstan and presidential elections in Tajikistan. We have one of a large country in Central Asia, Uzbekistan, and now the main attention focused on Uzbekistan as the country began to open up to the world, and Mirziyoyev government declared the country course towards democratizations. But again, however, the government statements are at odds with the actions. So government has not yet adopted the NGO code. And the main reason is the Uzbek government unwillingness to grant more freedom to independent NGOs by including the proposals in the new law. The other obstacles remain to the registrations of NGOs whose applications have been submitted by independent group of citizens, because Uzbek government prefers to register NGOs initiated by government or person who are affiliated with government. And for example, 19 out of 24 organizations are such registered by Ministry of Justice in last year. Also, we have big issues, big challenges with corruption. COVID also significantly contributed to the growth of corruption in procurement. So when governments began to abuse the norm of direct procurement, applying it to almost all areas of procurement. Within the open government agenda in our countries, in general, Central Asia countries as Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan have great ambitions to become leaders of the digital economy, e-governance, and become full members of in the global open government partnership. And now Kazakhstan is leading among Central Asia countries on digitizing public services, and more than 85% of services provided online. But there is, but again, there is a restriction on the publication of some data, especially budget data. Kyrgyzstan is leading in the introduction open data, open budget, public procurement, and this country is the first and only member of open government partnership. Uzbekistan also has great interest to be part of international community on transparency and accountability. And in September, the Minister of Justice of Uzbekistan in first time registered the country anti-corruption organization Transparency Uzbekistan, and the center intends to receive Transparency International accreditations, as well as cooperate with other international specialized structures. And Uzbek government has started implementing an interactive budget process for the first time. And in July, Ministry of Finance launched the open budget website. So, and also with support of open contracting partnerships, the Ministry of Finance of Uzbekistan plans to publish all procurement data in the public domain soon. So, about the conclusions and challenges in our regions. So, over the past decade, not maybe decade, more years, over the past 15 years, the presence of international institutions promoting democracy has significantly decreased in Central Asia region. The last survey of IRI and Civicus showed that interest in democratic values and their understanding decreased by 58%. And the region is strongly influenced by, not Russian, by Putin administration propaganda, and all discriminatory laws on civil society are taken from the Russian legislation. And also the one of issue is Chinese expansion through the bribery of political elites. In Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, China has provided and installed a facial recognition system despite of protest of human defenders and human rights defenders and activists. So I have one big point within the OGP membership and expand of the opportunities for Central Asia countries. So if there is an interest and political ambitions of the Central Asia governments to be part of OGP, it is more expedient to accept them and show the best practices of co-creation and interaction with civil society, and gradually introducing the best practices of transparency and accountability based on democratic principles, than to use isolation and distancing tactics, which causes a significant blow to civil society in our region and leaving no chance to their future development. Also, the entry into the OGP platform of large Central Asia countries as Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan will create competition in promoting reforms which can help reduce total dependence on geopolitical players and also make a balance among these players in the region. And more important, that development partners should consider the growth of populism and religious fundamentalism in the region. You can see the recent events in Afghanistan, Central Asia neighbor country. So, and need to pay attention to the introduction and expansion of civic education programs in spreading the key value of open government and open society across the Central Asia countries. So I finish my message and thank you everyone to listen to me. Yep, Helen.
Well, thank you, Dinardo. Quite a sobering readout from what is a tough region for advancing transparent and open governance and human rights and democracy in general. There are great powers in the region with a lot of influence, as you said. So it's not easy, but you also suggested a pathway forward for OGP, which was very, very interesting. We're going to move straight on now to the second segment. We are running a little over time, and if our panelists could keep to 4 minutes, that would be really fantastic. What you could do also with your questions, because inevitably we're going to run short of time, is if you have questions for specific panelists, put them in the chat. I can see one there for Nicola already, and Nicola's typing an answer, which is great. And other panelists, please feel free to chip in. And then what we haven't answered, we'll, I hope, get a little bit of time to put directly in the interaction with the panel as well. But we can do quite a lot in writing. Now, I'm going to call first Siddharth Varadarajan. I know, Siddharth, you're tight for time. In fact, you're sitting on a plane, I think. So please speak now so that we hear your words of wisdom before you go. Please come in. Siddharth, of course, is a decorated journalist. He co-founded The Wire, a non-profit journalism organization in India. Please come in now.
Right. I'll give you a glimpse of my face so that you know who I am. But my flight's about to take off, so thank you for bearing with me, and I'll be brief. I think some of the issues that the other speakers have raised resonate very clearly with us in India. The fact is that we are in a situation right now that is internationally recognized as backsliding. Many of the democratic values that we took for granted over the last 70 years are coming under increased stress. And as a journalist, I feel particularly concerned at the increasing threats and attempts to undermine freedom of the press in this country. The kind of pressure, I mean, there's historically been a certain degree of intolerance towards the media, and this is perhaps common to all democracies. But what we've seen over the last 5 to 6 years, but in particular, I would say since the onset of the pandemic, has been, I would say, a certain, thin-skinnedness on the part of the authorities when it comes to critical reporting. And it's highly unfortunate that a lot of this was triggered by governmental dissatisfaction at the nature of media coverage on the government's own response to the pandemic. So if we look at the record of the past, say, 12 to 14 months, record number of cases registered, criminal cases registered against journalists, literally from all parts of India, for stories that ordinarily ought to have been celebrated because they are highlighting some inadequacy in the official response to the pandemic or to providing people social protection in the face of the lockdown, which was announced with virtually no notice, or shortages of medicine, shortages of PPE kits, shortages of food in some cases, the distress that the pandemic and the forced migration that the lockdown generated. All of this, media coverage should have been seen as an early warning by the government, both at the federal level and at the state level, in order to better hone its response. However, the tendency in many instances was for the authorities to file criminal cases against reporters, against publications, and this is something which has, I would imagine, weakened India's national response to all the challenges that the pandemic has posed. We haven't really discussed the problem of fake news, but I think that when you put pressure on the media, which can serve as an important corrective to the spread of misinformation and disinformation, then that doesn't help, build public trust. It doesn't help raise the level of awareness in wider society about what's going on and how to deal with the pandemic. So I think that these are some of the, crucial issues. I should also mention that over the last 4 to 5 months, my publication, The Wire, has been central in exposing the use of surveillance technology, particularly the use of Pegasus spyware against members of civil society, against the political opposition, and against journalists. And I think that this has added a new and nasty layer to the menu of options that those in authority have to deal with what they regard as threatening coverage by the free press. And the problem with surveillance is that this essentially, takes away the media's ability to work on investigative stories, and because it essentially compromises the confidentiality of journalistic work. And this issue is now, of course, being formally probed by a special committee that the Supreme Court of India has set up, and I'm hopeful that this committee will conclude its work in a time-bound fashion and actually help us to pin responsibility for the illegal deployment of spyware and against not just the media, not just against reporters such as myself and those who work in my publication, but also lawyers, human rights defenders, in one instance, a former member of the National Election Commission. So these are all, disturbing elements in the, catalog of what would be called democratic backsliding. But when it comes to the media, I think this is something which is particularly troublesome. So I'll have to stop there because I think the aerospace is making noise for us to get ready for takeoff. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Siddharth. And we really admire your composure in the middle of a plane getting ready for takeoff to make those, incredibly interesting, but also very, very concerning reports, because we have looked to India as the largest democracy in the world to keep, that open space for civil society and journalists. And what you're describing is very concerning. So please enjoy your flight, and we will move right along. But of course, our session, which Siddharth connected into so wonderfully, is around these issues of narrowing civic space and widespread digital surveillance. Well, we've just heard about that from the India perspective, but let's now bring in Karul Ilagan, a journalist working at the Philippines Center for Investigative Journalism, which is a non-profit investigative organization based in Manila. I think we're all aware of the incredible pressure that journalists in the Philippines come under, including extrajudicial killings, and I saw a very disturbing one reported only earlier this week. So can we ask Karul, what can civil society do to push back against these awful trends we see in relation to the narrowing civic space and diminishing media freedoms in the region? Please come in. You have important things to say.
Thank you very much, Helen, and thank you to the Open Government Partnership for this opportunity to be part of this conversation. So coming from the context of the Philippines, of course, everyone is probably aware, of course, for nearly 6 years, the current administration in the Philippines has presented a model of animosity towards critics, whether it be journalists, activists, or citizens who raise valid questions about government policies and actions. Social media, as we know, has also spawned trolls and influencers who have been weaponized to spread disinformation and basically attack opposition. And with the COVID-19 pandemic happening, we have also observed all over the world further restrictions in space for participation, free speech, and press freedom. And this is primarily because control is central to the authoritarian approach to a health crisis. As an investigative journalist, of course, I can go on enumerating the problems, but the full picture also includes solutions. Even in this environment, in the context of the Philippines, we have witnessed examples and actually evidence of how civil society and journalists are able to help widen access to information and find avenues on how to strengthen government processes. In addition to the citizen participatory audit in the Philippines, we have seen good examples of how civil society is working to improve public procurement in the Philippines. In South Cotabato and Southern Philippines, for instance, with the support of the European Chamber of Commerce in the Philippines and HIVOS, the procurement process has improved with the regular presence of CSO observers in the activities of the Bids and Awards Committee. The local government has even issued an administrative order providing for internal rules and policies to improve its procurement process, as well as the development of a procurement data system that enables the uploading and analysis of procurement documents in machine-readable format. From Southern Philippines, we go to the nation's capital in a city called Pasig. Cleaning up the local government's procurement process and auditing its assets have led to savings, which in turn was used to support households during the pandemic. And our own work also at the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism, our investigative work has led to the government adopting recommendations that would increase more procurement information to be made publicly available. So I believe these examples are stark reminders that even in contexts of countries like the Philippines, civil society is able to claim space to participate and move the needle despite challenges. Of course, this is easier said than done. Two takeaways that I wish to share are, first, government is not a monolithic entity. So Rodrigo Duterte is not every politician or employee in government. In the examples that I shared, what has worked was finding a common ground with actors and stakeholders that share our goals, be it creating space for participation, realizing savings, more competition in the bidding process, adding more documents to a publicly accessible website, or turning PDFs into machine-readable formats. Second, what we've been able to achieve in the last 5 years would not have been possible without the work of civil society and journalists from decades ago, when they pushed for key reforms that led, for instance, to the passage of important laws like the Government Procurement Reform Act, which has provided solutions, and I would say some kind of guarantee that enable us to use and act on information that we're able to access now. I say this often. In a way, we are beneficiaries of the work done by the people before us, and I hope that we're able to do the same for the future generation. And my last point, of course, I'm not saying this with blind optimism, but I think it's important to understand also that we must not lose sight of an even better and just scenario if the political environment is not as difficult as it is. That is all for me. Helen, thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you for ending on a note of optimism, because we know the Philippines is capable of better than what you're experiencing at the moment. And it's due so much to committed people like yourself and other democratic and civil society activists that you keep the space open to be able to get movement when there are better times. So thank you so much for those reflections. So I'm going to fire some questions now at the panelists. We've got a few minutes for that. If I could bring Nicola back in from Vietnam, I think. Nicola, to what extent is open government contingent on digital access in all countries? To what extent is open government being compromised by the pace of addressing inequities in digital access? And what innovations do you see in this space?
Thanks, Helen. That's a really great question. I don't think it's contingent on digital access in these spaces. I mean, I think open government is also, as we know, it's an attitude, and it's a way of engaging with citizens, and it's an approach to how decisions should be made. Now, I think digital technology and access to digital technology can accelerate that. And is giving governments a whole lot of opportunities in which to facilitate more open governance. Now, we are seeing a bit of a patchy approach to this throughout Asia. In many ways, I think it's fair to say data governance, both the governance of GovTech, which Carol just alluded to, the GovTech where we see governments digitising PDFs and putting documents online and these sorts of things. These are fantastic, but they're quite slow moving and they're very resource intensive. Particularly, we've seen some of the work that we do at local government level where you're really trying to shift from paper-based to digital is going to be a long-term road. But at the same time, the governance around CivTech or civic technology that civil society organisations use to engage with government, the data governance policies and regulations around that still have quite a way to go as well. So around data responsibility, security, policies, storage on all sides of the equation. So I think that an acceleration of that agenda will enable, could enable and facilitate and also be the foundation to more open governance in the region. But I don't think it necessarily relies on that, because I think other ways in which, and the disposition that governments have towards civil society and an open governance agenda is just as important.
Thanks, Nicola. And let me bring Dinardo back in. Dinardo, we've seen across a number of OGP countries that when the incentives for open government come from outside the country, or incentives to join OGP come from outside the country as well, often there's a stalling of momentum after initial enthusiasm because you don't really have the buy-in, I guess, from government. Now, you talked about OGP's need to engage countries in the region, including those not eligible yet. How could we make sure, if OGP tries to do that, that you would get homegrown ownership of the agenda, including from governments? Would you like to offer an opinion on that?
Yeah, we should consider the historical situation within our region. It's a bad that our region depends from the some of special players on the ground, and we have no tradition of civil society, and this was from the Soviet background. So, and initially, when our countries get independence, so Western countries support our countries to build capacity of civil society organizations and build the civil society environment in our countries. But again, over the past 15 years, the international institutions, presence of international institutions decreased and totally decreased. And now we have no funding or opportunities to build capacity of the new generation of civil society actors. We have the new actors of the civil society on the ground. So this is challenge for our region. To build strong civil society representative and defend the human rights, defend the open government principles, and and in our countries we have more close regimes, and only Kyrgyz Republic has more freedom, freedom of information, freedom of voices. And the one player on the ground who has some of stronger civil society. And it's important when as international platforms as the OGP can accept this type of countries in order to present and demonstrate the best practices of the civil society interaction with government, and how we can the co-creation process, and presenting how we can build together their best open government within the transparency and accountability. Because informally, our governments, they start to open data, make more transparency, but without civic engagement. So this is our, unique situation.
I think you raise a really interesting issue in principle, which is should countries have to meet all the criteria to join a partnership like OGP, or would there be a process whereby being in a process to join could open up the opportunities to maybe full membership, but enable the information sharing and exchange of experiences? It's something I've heard debated in many other organizations, including EITI. You have to meet all the criteria before you come into the process. So
yeah, we know that this all criteria, it's important. But we should also consider the complex reasons within the special region or special country. So in order to save the civil society actors on the ground, maybe we should consider some of portional participants, maybe of civil society representative on the process of OGP, for example, from Kazakhstan or from Uzbekistan, because Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan is the big players in our region, not Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan is a small country. So, and it can make some of competition between countries in Central Asia and influence to some of geopolitical players.
Yeah, no, I think you're making a really important point, and I agree with your assessment. So anyway, much to reflect on there. Just one last question for Carol for this little segment. Carol, would you like to say anything about innovative strategies or examples you've seen from civil society or independent media to counterweight the, quote, official truth, end quote, around issues and reach broader audiences, particularly in complex environments? Come in, Carol.
Thank you, Helen. Coming from the vantage point of journalism, of course, what has been done in the Philippines is, of course, first, stories that expose the problem. But apart from that, I think that's not just enough. But what we've been doing at PCIJ, for instance, is also looking at innovative or different ways of storytelling. So not just, so usually a typical report would be heavily text-based, but now we are collaborating with artists, for instance, or people working in theater to help tell the story so it'll be more accessible to a wider audience. What we have done also is doing collaborations with other news outlets, not just within the Philippines, but also in the region. So that can help put a better spotlight on the issue that we are looking at. So again, new ways of storytelling and collaboration. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you so much. Very, very important answer. Now, we're just coming to the last segment of the panel in our last 20 minutes, and I almost feel embarrassed to ask our next speaker to only take 4 minutes because it is Syed Ikram Afzali, Executive Director of Integrity Watch Afghanistan and former Chief Information Commissioner in Afghanistan, who was the architect of the Afghan access to information law. And we're all aware of the tragedy that has befallen Afghanistan. I've had a lot to say about it myself, as many have. But Syed, what lessons can the OGP community draw from this horrible experience Afghanistan now has, and thinking about their own domestic open government agendas? And do you have any messages for us on behalf of Afghan civil society on how we can most usefully support you all, including those who remain, frankly, in danger in Afghanistan? Please come in, Syed.
Thank you very much, Helen. So, ladies and gentlemen, we all know Afghanistan has been going through some very difficult times, especially after the August 15, 2021 collapse of the government. As we were preparing for consultations for the third National Action Plan, the government collapsed and a new de facto administration took over. What we witnessed in August this year was history repeating itself. In fact, history of state failure and collapse repeating itself. Decades of conflict in Afghanistan has strong roots in bad governance, corruption, and injustices inflicted on our people. Among other things, failure of governments to represent people's values, aspirations, and needs has led to the collapse of the state over and over again. As many as 6 times in as little as 4 decades. We therefore need to address the issue of governance more than anything else. We need continuous engagement of the international community to hold the de facto administration accountable to its promises it made to protect the rights of Afghans, including those of the Afghan women and children, and to ensure inclusion and participation of all segments of the society in governance processes. It is also equally important to support people of Afghanistan in institutional building so that services are provided to the Afghan people in a transparent, accountable, and participatory manner using modern digital technology, building on their over 2 decades of investment. We should not let that investment go away and waste it. We cannot also let the country slide into another cycle of violence and bad governance. We have already gone through so much. Our experiences at Integrity Watch and other civil society organizations show that we are capable of bringing necessary reform and governance. The OGP process and the way civil society organizations contributed to that, co-creating 2 national action plans with some transformative commitments from the government and some achievement in delivering those commitments are examples that we can count on. Afghanistan's access to information law, considered to be one of the best laws in the world, and communities actively partaking in monitoring of services such as health and education during the conflict and the pandemic prove that if we have the right support, reform is possible, even under very difficult circumstances. I call on OGP countries to support civil society and civic space for those who are willing to continue their work in Afghanistan, to demand and promote open government and effective delivery of aid, especially humanitarian aid. Some great work is being done under some very difficult circumstances by NGOs trying to reach aid to every corner of the country. Civil society leaders and media workers who do not feel safe or face dire economic situation should be supported and relocated to safer places and should be provided with necessary support. OGP governments need to step up and take responsibility in this regard. Afghanistan is a test case for OGP countries. OGP is about people. It is about improving their lives. And we are experiencing a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding before our own eyes. It is critical to allow aid to reach to the Afghan people in an accountable manner to assist over 20 million people facing starvation. I hope OGP countries act before it's too late. Thank you, Madam Chair. Over to you.
Thank you, Syed, and your plea should not fall on deaf ears. The Afghan people are suffering hugely. They need support. It's going to be a tough, hard winter for many. It's one of the toughest humanitarian crises in the world right now. And the fact that, none of us, like the Taliban government, should not mean a blocking of aid to the Afghan people. So that's heard loud and clear. Can I bring in now Januar Nugroho, who's a former Deputy Chief of Staff at the Executive Office of the President of Indonesia. He's also an OGP envoy and was around when OGP was launched. So can I ask you, Januar, to reflect on trends our speakers have shared? What's taken the OGP community by surprise with any of these trends? And what advice do you have to OGP so that it remains relevant and capable of meeting the challenges ahead? Please come in.
Thank you very much, Helen, and thank you everyone for joining the session. And yes, surely I'm privileged to have been around since the early days of OGP's founding. And I think from the time I was in the government when OGP was founded until today, when I'm back to my role in the academia, I've witnessed how OGP evolves, I would say. What I saw coming back then was the enthusiasm, the spirit, the camaraderie of the open government champions, believing that our values, openness, transparency, participatory, innovative, would help make the government more open, more transparent, more accountable, and more responsive to the citizens. Those have been, and I believe will always be, the values we promote and fight for together, the government and civil society. We already realized from the beginning of this partnership that it was not easy. Not everyone, Helen, shared our values. It was not easy to argue the importance of government openness and transparency when they were faced by rampant corruption, for example, backdoor dealings with business, money politics, etc. Even the link between openness and development, for example, which to many of us today are obvious, were not so clear back then. These challenges remain until today, and even have become more salient, I must say. I have to say that apart from the pandemic COVID-19, actually nothing has really been a surprise. What we experience today, we have seen their seeds or signals, both strong and weak, a decade ago. With the pandemic COVID-19, to me, it's clear that we actually still have a lot of homework. One underlying factor so that the government can function and be open and transparent is its strong state capacity. Perhaps it is the key. The pandemic has opened our eyes that it was the state capacity that saves lives, actually. The pandemic hit every country on earth, but it is the government's capacity and ability in acting fast in weighing policy options, then implemented with support from its citizens, that really save lives. I witnessed closely my own country, Indonesia. The government has learned despite probably in a hard way, that the only way to earn and maintain trust from the citizens, and this way achieve meaningful development, is through good governance. Since the inception of OGP, Indonesia has been very active in promoting government openness and good governance. However, when the pandemic hit, of course, the challenge became bigger for the government, as the pressure to contain the pandemic tempted the government to be somehow rather pressing the voice of civil society, the journalists. But along the way, with strong pushback, the situation has improved. This makes me reflect what happens in our region, that apart from the pandemic, but likely to be worsened by the pandemic, over the past 10 years, we have seen the decline in the civic space across regions. The space for civil society and journalists is shrinking. Not only that some governments have become more limiting, but also the CSOs themselves are stagnating and fragmented, whilst playing their role in criticizing government policies and decisions. To me, these are worrying, because we see our societies are more polarized politically, and this happens in quite a number of countries. In addition to this, I think all other speakers have mentioned about concerning trends in economic, social, politics, including our journalism, and even environment with regard to climate crisis. So I would like to propose that we see all these trends and challenges from different angles, if I may, which is that these unprecedented challenges actually also provide us with unprecedented opportunities to promote our open government values. These crises actually are both wake-up calls for us, but also sound evidence that genuine progress cannot be achieved without the values we believe from the beginning of this partnership: openness, transparency, participatory, accountability. Crises will still happen in the future. What we can do is to prepare ourselves, both the government and civil society, as well as journalists. And the only way to go forward is to equip ourselves with these values. This is, Helen, how I see OGP will remain relevant in the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I think I would sum up what you said as saying, never waste a good crisis. You know, out of crisis can also come opportunity and innovation. So let's act in that spirit. Now, one question that came through, which I've offered an answer to myself online, was how can OGP member countries share their open government successes and difficulties directly with other members in the region? And I'd like to ask Dinardo first to have a crack at that, because I think Central Asia is clearly a region where we'd like to see more progress, but we appreciate the incredibly difficult context. So, Dinardo, what would help? What would help activists and advocates like yourself to advance these agendas?
Kyrgyz Republic actually is active use and adopt in the internal policies some of best practices from the members of OGP. For example, we have good case when we adopt from Philippine their it's audit with public participation. So we adopted this commitment into our audit agency, and this is in practice is not yet success, but again we include to their our legislation. So this is one of case when we can sharing best practices and experience from the other countries, and also we provide the best practices from OGP to other countries of Central Asia. And important that in Central Asia countries, civil society have great interest to be part of OGP, and they are pushing the government to create country-based open government platforms. So in Kazakhstan, actually they created open government initiative, and they have some of stimulating forum, they have meetings, and they discuss about the major reforms in the country with participation of civil society. In Uzbekistan also they're planning to create some of program or initiative under the Ministry of Finance related to open government principles and commitments. So because within the strong criteria of OGP membership, they on the awaiting list of these countries. So they have huge problems with the civic engagement, and they can't meet the fourth criteria on citizen engagement. So and Kazakhstan is working under this criteria, but other countries have, how to say, big gap within their civil society.
Thanks so much. Now, all our panelists were prepared to answer, quick fire, this question.
Sorry, Helen.
Yep. Sorry. I think everyone's hearing me. Everyone was prepared to answer this question, and it is, what is the most insightful or surprising book or article you've read in the past few years shaping your understanding of governance in our region? So quick fire. Nicola, what would you say?
Oh gosh, that's really, really hard. Oh gosh. Can I come last? I'm sorry.
You come last. Okay. Yanuar, do you have a thought on that?
Sorry, you asked about the book that I read?
Yeah. What's the most what book would you like to recommend that shaped our understanding of governance and challenges in the region? Book or article?
Well, I know, Helen. Let me give you a bit intro to my answer, which is the old saying that that it is about beliefs, right? About long-term vision open government. If you want to go fast, you may go alone with your own values. But if you want to go far, let us go together with our shared values, the values that we all believe to be the core in making the government more reliable, more listening, more responsive, more open, more accountable for its. So my friend just introduced me a very, very nice book, which to me, maybe I'm late in reading this book, but to me shapes a lot of my thinking, which is this one, The Righteous Mind. I believe many of you have read this book, right? But to me, this a simple book. Actually, it's not really simple at all, because it gives us understanding why we, good people, are divided by politics, why we are divided by this. And the title of the book is Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. But I think the main message here is it is the way we think, it is the way we comprehend our reality, our lives today, that actually plays the most significant role. So if we believe, and I genuinely believe, open government, our movement, as the world problem is not getting simpler, but getting much more complex, it is impossible for the government alone to address all the issues affecting the lives of the citizens. Government needs to work together with many non-state actors, including business, academia, media, and most importantly, civil society. So I think that's what I have in mind, Helen. I'm sorry if it's not appropriate, but to me that is the one that really helps me understanding why we are becoming like this. Thank you.
Right. Now we've got about a minute left before I have to wrap up. So I'm going to bring Syed back, and I'm going to ask Syed, is there anything that's giving you hope at the moment for your own national context? And apart from the very well-founded plea you've made for countries not to abandon Afghanistan at this hour of humanitarian need, what can this community do with and for your country right now?
Thank you, Helen. I think this is a very important question. I think we all can do, can contribute from our own, positions. The most important thing is to understand the case of Afghanistan as not, a country that is, that has only recently, lost its state and government structure and institutions. To understand this as a case where we can, where we all admit, we have made mistakes, and to basically to try to not turn away from Afghanistan because we failed there. I think it's important that we continue to understand better how governance can be transformed, how state-citizens relation can be transformed. And I think there are many actors who are involved on the ground, and I encourage other actors also to look at the work that some of the actors such as the Swedish Committee for Afghanistan or the Norwegian Refugee Council or others are trying to make a difference on the ground while delivering humanitarian aid, but also trying to advocate for the rights of women, for the rights of people. There are many civil society organizations, Afghan civil society organizations who are on the ground who need your support, who need your continuous dialogue and capacity building and being part of the process. I mean, I'm thankful to OGP to give me this platform, although our status at the moment, Afghanistan being a member of OGP, is not very clear. But it's important that we continue to be part of this dialogue and to be heard and to be given a platform. I think this is something that can really contribute to the transformation of the country. We cannot hope that things will change overnight. But we can, if we work together, hopefully things will change over a generation. We will see that kind of transformation that OGP countries have seen in many places. I'm hopeful that this can happen. I think we know the solution. It's about being patient and engaging and trying to deliver.
I think that these are really important points. We're so conscious that while there was a lot of focus on evacuation from Afghanistan, there's some roughly 37 million people still there, and they have hopes and dreams and needs that need to be fulfilled. And you're right to emphasize there is civil society on the ground. There are international NGOs on the ground. There are the multilateral institutions on the ground. There are ways of supporting Afghanistan, many, many ways. So let's focus on that, and let's take some hope from what you've just said. Look, we're 2 minutes over, so let me thank all the panelists who made wonderful points, and thanks for putting your suggestions about books in the chat box. I've noted a couple of those suggestions. And let's thank the Korean government for hosting us. The summit is ending tomorrow, but there's still a lot of events to go, including the Asia and Pacific Community Dialogue. There are the plenary sessions on anti-corruption also later today, and on inclusive digital innovation tomorrow, and then a closing plenary. So you can view the whole summit agenda at ogpsummit.org. Thanks so much, panelists. Thanks so much, audience. Thanks so much to the OGP support team. Over and out. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.